Welcome all to our 7th speaker series session in 2021. My name is Christoph Lüdke. I am a professor of business ethics at the Technical University of Munich, and I'm the director of the Institute for Ethics in AI. With our speaker series, we invite experts from all over the world to talk about ethics and governance of AI. These events serve as an important platform for sharing new research and exchanging knowledge. Since our launch in 2019, we were already able to run 16 speaker series events. Because of these virtual events in particular, we were able to reach an even broader audience from around the globe. So we are looking forward to hearing from you today during our discussion. Today, I'm exceptionally delighted to have with us John Tasioulas, director of the new Institute for Ethics in AI at the University of Oxford, which was announced in June 2019 and launched in February 2021. John Tasioulas is also professor of ethics and legal philosophy at the Faculty of Philosophy of Oxford University and senior research fellow at Balliol College. He's joining us here today from Oxford, and we are all looking forward to hear his views and expertise on this speaker series topic, which today is the uneasy relationship between human rights and public health, lessons from COVID-19 and AI. And it comes at a very good point in time, I believe. Let me say a few more words about our distinguished guest speaker. John Tasioulas received degrees in philosophy and law from the University of Melbourne and studied as a Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford, where he completed a DPhil on moral relativism under the supervision of Joseph Raz, whom I actually also had the pleasure to meet at one point. He was the former director of the Yeo Chong Lei Center for Politics, Philosophy and Law at King's College London. Before we begin, I would like to ask you to turn off your microphone and camera during the session and submit your questions via chat or raise your hand. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Also, let us know in the chat if you are experiencing technical difficulties. John, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Christoph, for that introduction. And it's great to be here, albeit virtually. And the talk I'm going to give is one I've given a number of times. So apologies for anyone who has basically heard the substance of it, but it's still a work in progress for me. So it's of great value to have the opportunity to have some feedback from you. In October 2019, the Global Health Security Index published its ranking of countries in terms of their preparedness for a health crisis. This was a mere 2 months before China alerted the World Health Organization of the outbreak of an acute respiratory illness in Wuhan, the new type of coronavirus, now known as COVID-19. In the ranking, the United States was placed top, with the United Kingdom second. These were two countries that, in fact, experienced great difficulty in controlling COVID-19, at least before the availability of vaccines. Meanwhile, countries that did a much better job, such as Singapore and New Zealand, were ranked 28th and 54th, respectively. Now, this underlines not only how poorly prepared some major advanced democracies were, but also how bad we are at measuring such preparedness. Of course, preparedness for a health crisis has many dimensions. For example, stockpiling personal protective equipment, ensuring the ability to cope with disrupted global supply chains, and establishing clear lines of authority with respect to particular questions, and so on. But today I want to focus on another kind of preparedness that the COVID pandemic makes especially salient, and this is our preparedness in terms of the ethical categories we bring to bear in addressing such a crisis. The need for ethical categories, for a clear and defensible articulation of our goals in health policy, is often obscured by politicians' need to avoid to be seen to make controversial value judgments. In the UK, the government reiterated the mantra that it was following the science. But this attempt to convert a political value judgment into a matter of technical expertise is, of course, conceptually obtuse. There is no question of simply following the science when it comes to public policy, because science offers signposts to beliefs about the world, but it doesn't tell us how we should act in the world. For that, we need to conjoin our most reliable beliefs about the world with a clear and defensible conception of our values and the reasons that they generate. So the question I want to raise today is that of our intellectual preparedness to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of our grasp of the relevant values at play and the relationships between those values. Philosophers, I believe, can play an important role in improving our preparedness to deal with health crises like COVID-19 by interrogating some of the key ideas we bring to bear when thinking through the challenges that such crises pose. Now, the easy way for me to establish my thesis would be to target the predominance of utilitarian and economic modes of thinking in public health. Despite their prominence, due in large part, I think, to the aura of objectivity and mathematical precision that they convey, such approaches tend to be guilty of two large errors. First, there's the tendency to reduce values to what is actually valued, to reduce values to preferences, often indeed of what one is willing to pay for. Second error is that they are committed to forms of optimization or aggregation across persons that tend to lose sight of the inherent dignity of each individual human being. So they tend to be open to the objection that they sacrifice the individual on the altar of some conception of the public good. And in fact, this objection was part of the popular dismay at the UK government's initial policy of herd immunity. So instead of this easy target, I'm going to focus on a public health discourse that does claim to uphold the dignity of each individual human being. And that's the discourse of human rights. Although it embodies a very laudable ideal, I believe that much of our contemporary thinking about human rights, especially in the health context, is itself in very bad shape. And I say that as a friend of human rights. I think if we want to defend human rights, we need to understand that often some of its biggest enemies are people who present themselves as human rights advocates or friends of human rights. Failure to understand human rights and how they relate to other values obstructs us in being able to formulate clear and justified policies in response to the COVID pandemic, policies that all of our fellow citizens can get behind. So I'm going to focus on two mistakes about rights, a mistake about their scope and also a mistake about their content. So the scope is the subject matter they range over. Their content is what specific entitlements they afford us within that subject matter. And I'm also going to focus on some mistakes about the relation of human rights to two other important values. One is common goods, including public health goods, and the other important value is democracy. So in discussing human rights, I'm going to take as my main example the human right to health, since it seems to be the most relevant one for this context. The right to health is referred to in many international instruments, for example, Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and also Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which refers to, quote, the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Now, one could quibble about that formulation, in particular, the reference to the highest attainable standard, but I'm just going to put that aside for now. So I said one of the problems I think we have in using the discourse of human rights to engage with issues like COVID is a problem about the scope of such rights. So let's think about this in terms of the right to health. Now, by scope of rights, what I mean is the subject matter of the duties associated with the right in question. It is natural to think that some human rights obligations come within the scope of some rights, whereas other human rights obligations come within the scope of different rights. So the duty to prevent people from suffering hunger comes within the right to food, or perhaps more broadly, the right to an adequate standard of living. It doesn't come within the right to freedom of religion or to a fair trial. And the duty to allow people to participate in the political life of their community comes under the right to political participation, not the right to privacy or the right to work. So we think of particular rights as having their particular subject matter. And they're differentiated in part by having a distinct subject matter. But if we think about the prevailing human rights discourse, and I'm here referring specifically to the discourse of international human rights law, we can ask the question, what are the entitlements that fall within the scope of the human right to health? And one of the amazing things is that the standard understanding of the right to health in this international legal discourse is incredibly expansive. So I'm now referring to publications of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, of the World Health Organization, of the general comment on human rights produced by the Human Rights Committee, by work by people, leading scholars such as Larry Gostin, leading global health scholar. What do they think comes within the scope of the human right to health? Well, it's an amazingly expansive list that includes entitlements to food, entitlements to housing, entitlements to life, education, privacy, access to information, gender equality, entitlements to work, to social inclusion, to freedom from torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading forms of treatment or punishment. So, in other words, if you think about the scope of the right to health, it seems on this standard view now, the standard view within what you might call the prevailing international human rights discourse, it swells up to include a huge amount of other rights. So this one right basically overlaps massively in scope with rights that are elsewhere recognized in the system. What's the reason for this? Why are all these rights, all these entitlements being shoehorned under the right to health? The answer seems to be that they all potentially affect our interest in health, because it's certainly the case that if you're unemployed, this can affect your interest in health. It's certainly the case if you're subject to racial or gender discrimination, this could impact negatively on your interest in health. It's certainly the case that if you're deprived of housing or education, this can have a deleterious effect on your health. So the rationale seems to be the subject matter of the right to health is basically any entitlement that in some way bears on one's health. And this approach, which I think of as a massively bloated approach to the right to health, is not limited to the right to health. The standard discourse on other rights adopts a similar view. So recently, Human Rights Committee produced a general comment 36 on the right to life, and it reconstrued, as it were, the right to life as the right to enjoy a life with dignity. And then what it found was that the right to life actually encompassed huge swathes of socioeconomic rights, because unless you have these socioeconomic rights, you cannot have a life of dignity. So instead of thinking of it as one particular discrete right that belongs to the civil and political domain, it suddenly encompasses entitlements from the economic, social, and cultural domain. So I think of this as a problematic, bloated view of human rights and of their scope. And why is it problematic? Well, first of all, it undermines the whole rationale for having a list of human rights. What's the point of having distinct human rights being identified in particular instruments if, in fact, they massively overlap in their scope? It undermines also our ability to identify whether a particular right is being fulfilled. Because if the human right to health includes all those other entitlements, then the task of figuring out whether in any given society the human right to health is being fulfilled becomes a Herculean task of figuring out whether pretty much the whole schedule of human rights is being fulfilled. And I think it dilutes the normative focus of each right. The focus of these rights, whether it's torture or right to life or health, becomes diluted because they all bleed into each other. But I think there's a deeper problem, and the deeper problem is that this tendency, this bloating of the scope of rights, tends to identify, for example, the human right to health with our interest in health, and therefore sees any entitlement that advances our interest in health as part of the human right to health. But the key thing to bear in mind here is human rights are not interests. They may be grounded in interests, but there are many things that would further my interest in health that I don't have a right to. So you always have to ask the question, what are the obligations associated with the right, with any given right? And once you raise the question, what are the obligations associated with the rights, then you have a further question, which of these obligations belong to which particular right? So which of them belong to the right to education, which of them belong to the right to health? If there's massive overlap, then the whole idea of having a list of rights becomes undermined. So part of the problem here, I think, is the claim made by figures such as Jonathan Mann. He was a great American public health figure, very important in the fight against HIV and AIDS. His claim was that health and human rights are complementary approaches to the central problem of defining and advancing human well-being. Well, I want to say yes and no. You can't defend human rights without reference to human interests, but they are not the same as interests. If they were the same, it could be argued that it would be acceptable to torture one person to save 3 other innocent people from being tortured. If it's all about interests, then the idea is, well, why not torture the one innocent person? Because their interest in not being tortured is outweighed by 3 other innocent people not being tortured. But you can't just reduce human rights to those interests. They're about obligations, and those obligations in this particular case would rule out torturing the one innocent person to prevent someone else torturing 3 others. Once you've focused on the fact that human rights concern obligations, then you have to take the next step and say, which obligations belong to which rights? There might be some overlap in this, but there can't be the massive overlap that has become part of the standard discourse of human rights. So that's the first claim I'm making, that we have a problem in mobilizing the language of human rights because of this bloated conception that undermines each individual human right as a standard of assessment by making its scope encompass pretty much all other human rights. But there's another problem, in some ways a more insidious problem, and that is the problem of the content of these rights. And the content of the rights is the following question. I should say, in relation to the issue of scope, my answer to the problem of scope is, I think we need to think of human rights, the right to health, the human right to health, as having a limited scope. Its scope is limited by the subject matter of its obligations. And I say the subject matter of the obligations associated with the right to health are provision of medical care, public health measures, and certain social determinants of health. So what makes something part of the right to health is that it's an obligation relating to those 3 things: medical care, public health measures, and certain social determinants of health. It doesn't become part of the right to health because our interest in health is implicated by it. Because if that were the case, then pretty much every human right would become part of the right to health, because almost every human right bears on our interest in health. So let's assume that we proceed on my basis, that the scope of the right to health concerns obligations relating to medical care, public health measures, and certain social determinants of health. Question now arises, what obligations of that sort do we have or are generated by the human right to health? Now, the second problem that I see in the discourse is a tendency to give human rights, even if limited in scope in this way, an excessively demanding content, an excessively demanding and unrealistic and almost utopian content. So more and more things are shoehorned under human right to health than can possibly be justified. Now, one classic example of this relates to a very special category of human rights obligations called minimum core obligations. So if we think about socioeconomic rights, it's generally understood that they are subject to a doctrine of progressive realization. It might not be possible to fulfill all the obligations of socioeconomic rights immediately because of resource constraints. So the doctrine of progressive realization says, if there are these resource constraints that prevent the immediate fulfillment of human rights, then what a state should do is over time progressively realize these rights, take steps to ensure their fulfillment. But as I interpret the doctrine of minimum core obligations, what that doctrine says is, however, although it's true that socioeconomic rights are subject to this idea of progressive realization in the case of resource limitations, there is a subset of obligations of socioeconomic rights that must be fulfilled immediately. So these obligations are not subject to progressive realization. So it might be, for example, to take the right to food, that there is an obligation to provide healthy, nutritious food of various kinds to people. But it might be very difficult to achieve that in certain situations of resource constraints in poorer countries. So the obligation on them is to progressively take steps to provide healthy, nutritious food. But there's also another obligation under the right to food, which is to prevent people from starvation, suffering from starvation, to prevent hunger. It could be argued that that obligation is different. That obligation is a minimum core obligation that must be satisfied immediately. Now, under General Comment 14, there is a list which I won't go into, General Comment 14, generated by the UN system interpreting the right to health, of all the minimum content obligations of the right to health. And what is important to stress about this is that many of these obligations that are being presented not even as, oh, you must realize this progressively over time, but you must achieve this right now, are incredibly demanding, so demanding that pretty much even the most advanced countries and the wealthiest countries are far away from realizing them. So what's happening? What's happening is the content of the right to health is being specified in a way that really doesn't issue in obligations, because what you have is just a list of goodies, a list of things that would further one's interest in health, but it's not at all obvious that it's realistic to impose these as obligations. And one of my favorite statements on this is by John Tobin, the Melbourne academic lawyer who has written what I think is the best study of the right to health. And referring to the General Comment 14 and its characterization of minimum core obligations, this is what Tobin says. And he's a very acute, methodical scholar who's written up, as I say, what I think is the best treatise on the right to health. He says, the vision of the minimum core obligation of states under the right to health, as advanced by the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Committee, is disassociated from the capacity of states to realize this vision. It simply does not offer a principled, practical, or coherent rationale which is sufficiently sensitive to the context in which the right to health may be operationalized. Another way of putting this is to say, the content of the right to health could not simply be a list of goodies with respect to our interest in health. It must genuinely be things that there is an obligation to provide. Now, because that tends to be forgotten, you get a lot of skepticism about the right to health, because it just looks like a list of things that would further our interest in health in terms of medical care, public health measures, and certain social determinants of health. So one classic formulation of this objection comes from the development economist William Easterly. Easterly says, the right to health, understood in this way, is useless in terms of guiding policy because it represents, and I quote, a claim on funds that has no natural limit, since any of us could get healthier with more care, right? So we've taken something that's meant to specify the content of an obligation and simply specify the content of something that would further one's interest in health. And you can see this in many ways. People's interests can be furthered in innumerable ways, their interest in health. My interest in health, if I'm in dire need of a kidney transplant, might be furthered by you giving me your spare healthy kidney. But it doesn't follow from the fact that it would be furthered in that way that you have an obligation to give it to me. You've got to go beyond simply saying this would advance the interest. Now, one question someone might pose is, well, why not celebrate this development? Why not celebrate this expansive view of the content of human rights as an aspirational ideal? And the answer I would give is, Well, you could celebrate it as an aspirational ideal, but then you're doing something quite profound. You're shifting away from the thought that human rights involve obligations, and that the key thing about obligations is that they are requirements which it is wrongful for us to violate, whereas an aspiration is something we can try to achieve, but no moral wrong necessarily follows from violating it. And I think what I've described here is this issue about this excessive bloating of the content of a right by basically identifying it with an interest and not thinking about what are the obligations this interest generates. I think one of the things I'd like to point out is that there is a broader doctrine that very much facilitates this kind of idea, and that's the doctrine of proportionality in human rights. The doctrine of proportionality, which has become very popular in Europe and which is now spreading globally, or has spread globally, has the tendency to do two things. One, to simply say, look, a right is in question when an interest is affected. So your right is in question when an interest is affected. And then it says the next step is to figure out whether affecting your interest in that way is justified. So you've got to do some sort of balancing analysis. But the consequence of that is a widespread tendency to say, yes, you have a right to this, but your right is justifiably overridden because in the balancing analysis, there is a sufficient state interest or whatever to justify overriding your right. So the German constitutional theorist and lawyer Matthias Kumm summarizes it like this, and I want to point out, he is a defender of the doctrine of proportionality, but his summary is, a rights holder does not have very much in virtue of having a right. An infringement of the scope of the right merely serves as a trigger to initiate an assessment of whether the infringement is justified. So, let that sink in. A right holder, we're talking about human rights now, a right holder does not have very much in virtue of having a right. So that is the logical outcome of this view, because if a right is going to be construed so broadly as a legally cognizable interest, then of course that doesn't really settle anything. You then have to go to the analysis, is it the case that this interest nonetheless ought to be respected? Now, what gets lost here? What gets lost here, I think, is the idea that rights involve duties, that it's essential obligations. I'm using duties and obligations interchangeably, that it's essential to the nature of something being a right that it generates an obligation. Now, why is that lost here? Well, the answer is as follows. An interest is something that is regularly overridden, right? Constantly, you have to make decisions about yourself, about others, where you have to trade off one person's interest against another person's interest. But an obligation is supposed to be different. An obligation of its very nature is something that cannot be regularly overridden. If someone says, well, I have an obligation to look after my children, oh, but it's regularly overridden, or as Kumm says, it doesn't amount to very much because I still have to think about how to balance that obligation in relation to other things I want to do, like play sport or whatever. That doesn't compute, right? So the idea is, if you have an obligation, then it's the kind of thing that of its nature must be resistant to being overridden. Not absolutely resistant. Perhaps there are some human rights obligations that are absolutely resistant. Perhaps the right to torture, not to be tortured, generates obligations that are absolutely resistant to being overridden. Maybe there are other human rights obligations that are not absolutely overridden. But when they are overridden, it tends to be in exceptional emergency situations. Whereas the doctrine of proportionality, because it has this broad understanding of the content of the right, has to say, being overridden is something that happens all the time. It's a systematic feature of rights. My claim is you lose then what's distinctive about rights is that they are about obligations owed to the right holder. So I'm happy to talk in the discussion about how we get around this. What I've tried to do is, in other work, try to talk about the considerations you have to bear in mind in getting from saying, yes, I have an interest in this, this would further my interest in health, to saying, there is an obligation for you to provide this to me as a matter of right. And there you would have to take on board considerations like, is it possible to deliver this for all human beings? Is it feasible to do so, or is it excessively costly? Now, cost is not going to be here determined just by the market. It has to be determined by some broader understanding of the other goals we want to pursue. And thirdly, you have to think about overall coherence. Rights have to be compossible. It must be possible in general to comply with all human rights. They can't be constantly getting in the way of each other. So you need to specify the content of those rights in a way that makes the obligations they generate possible, feasible, and in some sense compatible with the other rights you want to recognize. That is a very difficult task. It's a task that philosophers can contribute to but cannot complete. At some level, it needs to be completed by law, but it's a much more difficult task than the task of simply saying, this is something that would facilitate or further my interest in health. That's not even getting us into the discourse of human rights yet, because it still hasn't got into the discourse of obligations. I've got a cynical view about why this happens, which is why this proliferation happens, both in terms of scope and content of rights. If you were someone determined not to respect human rights, you might be very happy about the developments I've described, because what it does is that it effectively trivializes rights. It makes them so all-encompassing and so broad that they're constantly subject to trade-offs because it's not possible to comply with them all. And so if you were a state that was not particularly interested in human rights, you would encourage this proliferation of human rights, because then you could always justify your rights violations by saying, well, we have limited resources, we have to pick and choose between these excessively demanding considerations. We chose to comply with this at the cost of not being able to comply with that. So I think a very serious commitment, a genuine commitment to human rights would take seriously the thought that you have to be able to specify them in ways that preserves what's distinctive about them, which is that they generate very demanding moral requirements on states and others that are only in exceptional circumstances to be overridden. They're not overridden just as a matter of course. I want to talk now about the final thing I mentioned, which is how rights, human rights, relate to other sorts of considerations like common goods and democracy, and that will eventually lead us into a discussion a little bit about AI. Now, if we adopt the more analytically rigorous conception of human rights that I've been advocating, then we're going to find out two things about global health policy. The first thing we're going to find out is that we can't formulate global health policy exclusively in terms of either the right to health, exclusively in terms of the right to health. So Larry Gostin, the leading scholar in this area, says there should be a framework for thinking about global health policy that is exclusively grounded in one consideration, the right to health. And you can see why he says that, partly because he thinks the right to health encompasses all these other rights. For me, this is a mistake because I don't have this bloated conception of the right to health. I think the right to health is one right amongst others. So in any adequate global health policy, you need to appeal to more than just the right to health. For example, one of the best ways of furthering women's health is by furthering women's education. But the education of women is something that comes under the right to education, not primarily under the right to health. But the second point I would make is not only do we need to look at the totality of human rights, not just the right to health, we also have to look to other values that are not necessarily rights involving values. And the key one that I want to stress at the moment is common goods. So what do I mean by a common good? Well, here are some examples. It's a common good, a good of all the people in a particular community, to live in a culture that values health and fitness. We all benefit from living in a culture that values health and fitness. Another common good, we benefit from living in a culture of altruism and solidarity. For example, a culture in which people are willing to participate in clinical trials in order to further medical advances. Now, as Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, said, one of the key factors in how effective states' responses to the COVID pandemic was the degree of solidarity that citizens displayed. So I'm just quoting from him, because it's nice to have a banker lauding the value of solidarity. He says, people went beyond compliance with the law and engaged in mass efforts of community altruism. People sewed masks, delivered food to vulnerable populations, and publicly cheered the heroism of frontline workers. As private voluntary groups to address community needs burgeoned, government started formal volunteer campaigns. In the UK, an appeal for NHS volunteers received over 1 million applicants. Governments encouraged such altruism by emphasizing the good that social distancing did for others. So it's very important. Solidarity as a factor in generating a strong response to COVID. And it's not entirely clear that solidarity is something that can be fully captured under the rubric of rights, but it is clearly a common good. So when I say a culture of health and fitness is a common good, a culture of solidarity is a common good, and that they promote health generally, what does it mean to say that they're common goods? So here I think it's important to draw a distinction. The dominant view of the common good, especially in the Anglophone tradition, comes from utilitarianism. And that is a fundamentally aggregative conception of the common good. It basically says, we determine the common good by balancing benefits and burdens across all people. And the thing that yields the greatest overall benefit is the thing that ought to be done. That is what's in the common good. But in this process, notice, some people are winners and some people are losers. Some people's interests are sacrificed in order for a greater benefit for somebody else. And that's what leads to the constant complaint about utilitarianism, that it potentially ignores the distinctness of individuals and is prepared to sacrifice some people for the greater benefit of others. So that's the notion of the utilitarian notion of aggregation that I was setting aside at the beginning, that I said I wasn't going to consider that. So if I'm not talking about that, what am I talking about when I talk about the common good? Well, my view of the common good is a pre-utilitarian, almost pre-modern conception. It's one that you can find in Aristotle, in Plato. And the way to think about it is a common good exists if it meets three conditions. It serves everyone's interests, it serves everyone's interests in the same way, and it's serving someone's interest is not in any way in competition with serving someone else's interest. So a classic example of a common good would be a shared language. So let's say the English language in Britain serves everyone's interest. It serves everyone's interest as a means of communication. It serves everyone's interest in the same way by affording them a way of formulating their thoughts and expressing their ideas and so forth. And it's serving one person's interests is in no way incompatible with serving another person's interest. My use of the English language in no way takes away from the opportunity of someone else to use the English language. Now, if we see rights in the common good in this way, I think what we end up having, as I've argued elsewhere, is a more harmonious conception of them than would emerge if we think of the common good in the aggregative utilitarian terms. So a lot of people, because they assume something like utilitarianism is part of the truth about ethics, and then they realize that, if you have the utilitarian conception of the good, you might have to sacrifice some people for the overall good, and some of these sacrifices seem extreme and oppressive. They say, we must therefore bring in rights to trump the common good in cases where it threatens people in that way. I don't have that view. My view is we shouldn't begin from the utilitarian conception of the common good in the first place. We should begin from the Aristotelian conception. And from that conception of the common good, you'll discover that some common goods are essentially concerned with human rights. So for example, a system of fair trials, a vaccination program, trying to achieve herd immunity. These are all common goods that, in a sense, cater to basic rights that people have. But there are other common goods that go beyond what we can claim as a matter of right. So for example, I don't have a right to live in a culture that is a vibrant literary and artistic culture. It's a common good to live in such a culture, but it would be too burdensome for me to say I have a right that such a culture be created, and the same goes for a culture of health and fitness. So if we have this understanding of the common good, then we don't have this kind of ever-present tendency to say there's a fundamental conflict between what benefits all and what is in what rights people have. Now, someone might say, look, it's long been recognized that we need both individual rights and public health goods, common goods, in formulating a defensible health policy. Now, there is a very interesting discussion of this issue from a historical perspective in John Fabian Witt's new book, American Contagions, Epidemics and Law from Smallpox to COVID-19, which was published last year. Witt is a legal historian at Yale Law School. Now, Witt refers to the great American public health figure I've already mentioned, Jonathan Mann, and his pioneering work on HIV/AIDS, both for the US and for the UN's Global Program on AIDS. Now, Mann's insight was that rights in public health could be harmonized because respect for human rights leads to markedly better prevention and treatment. So the idea was there wasn't this conflict between public health goods, better prevention and treatment, and human rights, because respect for human rights actually facilitates better prevention and treatment. His argument was, Mann's argument was, in the context of AIDS, that coercive measures that breach human rights, that breach basic liberties, undermine the trust required for people to comply with public health measures. It drives a disease underground and facilitates its spread. So it turns out, just as a matter of empirical fact, according to Mann, that human rights and public health goals, like achieving herd immunity, are not starkly opposed. On the contrary, respecting human rights is a way of effectively bringing about the realization of those health goals. But, and here is the worry, this reconciliation, although important so far as it goes, is a precarious one. It is merely contingent. It's dependent on circumstances that may change. And Witt helpfully identifies one major change in circumstances that may make it no longer the case that voluntary compliance is the most efficient way to achieve public health goals. And here, the threat to rights is seen as coming from new digital technologies. Now, Witt puts it like this, and I'm quoting, "New technologies, such as apps for cell phones and cell phone tracing, threaten to alter the precarious balance between liberty and health. If states or other powerful institutions were able to develop technologies capable of testing, tracking, and tracing individuals in ways that defeated evasion, then the calculus between individual rights and public health may change." So what he's saying is, under Jonathan Mann's dispensation, there happened to be this empirical link between respecting people's liberties and their human rights and achieving public health goals, because only by respecting their rights and liberties could you get them to cooperate in the right way needed to secure those public health goals. But this is now transformed by digital technologies, which makes it unnecessary to secure the buy-in of individuals in that way. So what Witt puts forward here as a hypothetical possibility has acquired a kind of concrete reality, as shown by the fact that some authoritarian or less than liberal democratic societies in Asia, such as Singapore, had greater success in stemming the COVID pandemic than liberal democracies like Britain, France, and the US. So implied here is a broader ideological struggle between liberal democracy and rising authoritarian powers in the world today. Which of them are best equipped to protect their rights from public health crises like the COVID pandemic? Now, Witt raises a very important question that we all need to struggle with, but we can already see it embodies some highly contestable assumptions. First, that relations between human rights and public health goods are essentially contingent, whereas I have argued that they are also importantly constitutive, i.e. that securing rights can be part of the common good, not simply a means for achieving the common good. And second, that it's likely that Witt has adopted the utilitarian aggregative conception of the common good. But I want to close now with some remarks about the role of democracy and again, the bearing of AI in that connection. So could democracies lose out in the battle to secure the right to health and the wider public health goods of which it is a component? Could there be this defeat of democracy in this ideological struggle, and that COVID is the kind of crucible for this issue? This leads us to consider the tricky question of how human rights are related to democracy. Now, some, I think, posit an excessively close connection between human rights and democracy. Some will say it's not truly a democracy unless it respects all human rights. Now, I think that that's a mistake. I think the notion of democracy is sufficiently distinct from the idea of human rights for reasons of the sort given by the American political theorist Josiah Ober in his book Demopolis, where democracy is understood as collective self-government on the part of free and equal citizens, but that this can exist even if the totality of human rights is not being respected. Others try to derive the content of human rights from democratic procedures. So in answer to the question, what is the content of the right to health? What does the right to health entitle me to? Thinkers like Norman Daniels at Harvard have argued, well, that is determined by a democratic process. And I think that's a mistake, because democracy is not an answer to the question, what is morally right or wrong? Democracy is an answer to a different question, which is about a legitimate form of government. What do I have an obligation to do in terms of, do I have an obligation to obey this law? Part of the answer would be, yes, I have an obligation to obey this law because it was democratically enacted, even if it is morally defective. So democracy can't be the answer to that question. On the other hand, there are those who regard that there is a kind of deep conflict. This is the other extreme. They think there's a deep conflict between human rights and democracy. They think of human rights as counter-majoritarian norms. Now, I think this is also misguided. Again, I think it's influenced by the aggregative conception of the common good and the assumption that the whole point of democratic structures is that they are institutional mechanisms for identifying this aggregate conception of the common good, because it's assumed, for example, that people vote their own personal interest, and then these different votes that reflect the interests of each individual are then aggregated through the process of voting. I think that's a mistake, partly because I think it's a mistake that in a democracy people vote their interests. I think they should be voting their conception of the common good. But I think the key message we should take on the empirical question of the instrumental relationship between human rights and democracy is from Catherine Sinking's book, the book Evidence for Hope. And the conclusion of that book, which looks into the question, what are the means through which you can best foster human rights? And her argument is the single most important factor that works for the fulfillment of human rights is the creation of a democratic government. And I simply want to suggest, in response to Witt's challenge, that although digital tech may have a dark authoritarian side, it also has a positive democratic aspect. Indeed, it may help facilitate more radically participatory forms of democratic governance, as theorists like Helene Landmore at Yale have argued. And going back to COVID, we have a concrete example of this in Taiwan, where under the leadership of the country's first digital minister, Audrey Tang, participative, community-built digital tools have been used to create a more democratic, open, and inclusive form of government. I know that Taiwan's experienced some difficulties with COVID more recently, but for a long time, it was world leading in its response. Despite having only 3% of people vaccinated, it had the lowest per capita deaths in the world, and it managed to have this whilst avoiding the necessity for lockdowns. Now, a digital platform called Polis in Taiwan gathers and analyzes diverse opinions from citizens and synthesizes them into insights that can be plugged into decision-making processes. And these synthesized views lead to action in 80% of cases. There are also digital tools for combating disinformation campaigns, for example, regarding COVID, without resorting to censorship. So, for example, state agencies are required to correct false claims within 2 hours, often using the technique humor over rumor, so using humor to debunk various kinds of disinformation and anti-vax claims that were being made. Now, of course, this only has been possible due to background policies such as widespread digital education, universal healthcare, and universal broadband access. And I highly recommend Divya Siddharth's paper, available online on the Radical Exchange website, Taiwan, Grassroots Digital Democracy That Works. So in short, I would want to suggest democracy seems to be part of the ethos that best secures human rights and public health goods alike, in part by fostering the kind of citizen solidarity that is required by both. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I think it's a very, very timely topic now. I just wanted to remind that a few days ago, actually, the Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas was cited by saying she warns the West of a damage from COVID-induced authoritarianism, and which is a very interesting Is that also something that you would see as a possible menace ahead?
Absolutely. I think that one of the issues here is that we are in a kind of global competition, an ideological competition. This is one of the interesting facets of the times that we're living through right now, that many things that were taken for granted are now open issues. And there's a kind of disturbing lack of confidence in democracy amongst young people in particular in advanced democratic societies. So we're dealing now with a situation of radical ideological conflict. And I tried to hint at some of this in the past. So even something like human rights, very crudely, there's a kind of triangle of conflict at the moment. So there's the kind of Chinese view of rights, which is you only have rights through good behavior, only through social credit. Only if you behave well and are a good citizen will you have entitlements. You don't have entitlements that you haven't earned, as it were. And then there's the American, if you like, let's call it that, view of rights, which is rights are quite small in number, but they're very strong in effect. And then there's what we might call a more European view of rights, which is, no, rights are actually quite large in number, but precisely because they're so large, they're often subject to trade-offs. So we have this kind of ideological struggle going on. And I think one of the crucibles for thinking about where we're going to end up is partly going to be responses to crises like COVID, responses to crises like the climate crisis. Absolutely.
And I have to say, I very much loved your treating of the proportionality principle, because that's one that I also make frequent reference to. But you're right; it should not be used in a way that reduces the scope or the impact of the fundamental rights, and that might happen. So yeah, it's a very interesting thought. I have not yet given much thought.
No, I think that's right. I think there was a lot of confidence about the proportionality doctrine, but even now I'm noticing very senior legal figures starting to have reservations. There is a grain of truth, I think, in the proportionality doctrine, which is that sometimes rights are overridden. But I think it goes too far to say that they are systematically overridden. So what's the answer? The answer, I think, is to say we need a more precise specification of the content of the duties. Once we have that more precise specification of the content of the duties, we can say things like, it's not that the right is overridden. If I'm locked up because I commit murder, it's not because my right to freedom has been overridden by the need to do justice. My right to freedom does not include being free when I've committed murder, right? So that's where the wisdom of proportionality should go, in specifying the content of the duties.
Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat. So one is, you have elaborated on the relation between rights and the corresponding obligations of governments to provide. The rights of the right holder generates a duty and an obligation for the government. I wonder why the topic of personal responsibility for one's own health seems to be ignored in this context. Would not a right to health also generate an obligation to avoid, for example, large crowds during a pandemic? I'm shortening a bit here. Yeah.
Great, that's a wonderful question. So I did talk a lot about rights as imposing duties on states. But one of my views, which didn't come out in the paper, so I'm thankful for the question, is that I have a pluralistic view of the duty holders. So I think it's not just states. It's true that in international law, the primary duty bearer is states, but that's a feature of international law. It's not a feature of rights in themselves. So I think the duty bearers of rights can be lots of different agents, including corporations. So we see that in the UN's document on business and human rights, its guiding principles. It doesn't have any legal force, but it's got moral force. The corporations have human rights obligations. And I absolutely agree, individuals have obligations. And so it could be that an individual is violating my right to health by not taking the requisite sorts of measures. There's another thing that I think was implied in the question, which is my entitlements under the right to health may be affected by my own behavior. So this is very interesting under the right to health, because what if someone constantly comes forward seeking medical treatment, even though they have disregarded the advice that they were given, right? So let's assume that not issues of addiction or something like that, but they freely choose to disregard the advice they're given and come forward and say, look, I need that expensive operation again. I need that expensive treatment again. I think it's very arguable that the content of the right to health, the obligations under it, should be sensitive in some contexts to the behavior of the person, that they had a duty to look after their own health, and their failure to do so may impact on what they're entitled to under the right to health. But that's a very tricky thing to operationalize, very tricky to operationalize. But in principle, I think that's correct.
Okay. There's another question. Who should be in charge or involved in the development of ethical frameworks for AI? So very general question.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think that in charge is a difficult question. So in charge implies their say-so will have authority. Their say-so will determine what should be the case. So I think as a Democrat, and going back to my claim from Catherine Sinkink, that the most effective means of securing rights is through democracy, I think it has to be the democratic polis itself, the democratic polity. But we have to understand, however, that democracy has preconditions. It's not just an opinion poll. It is about deliberation based on genuine information. And in that process of genuine information and genuine deliberation, academics can play an important role because they can, as experts, provide genuine information. And also, I think philosophers in particular have a special responsibility to model for the rest of society how to conduct rational civil debate with people you disagree with on value questions. And hopefully that can feed in. But in terms of in charge, I think ultimately it has to be the democratic public.
Here's a very broad question. I hesitate to bring it to you. But what are the ethical considerations in the use of AI to manage pandemics?
So that's a really good question. I don't think that there is an answer to that. Some people will say, oh, the ethical considerations are human rights. Right? And so there is this kind of assumption that if you're talking about AI, there must be a part of ethics that specifically relates to AI. I think that's a mistake. I think AI is so pervasive, and the pandemic is so pervasive in its effect, that pretty much all ethical considerations are relevant. So if on the one hand, you want to say rights are relevant, for sure, but there's also going to be issues, for example, with respect to AI, about the environment. What if AI has a terrible footprint in terms of environmental damage? Now, some of that can be understood in terms of, well, it impacts on our ability to fulfill human rights. But if environmental degradation leads to the extinction of the whale, is that a human rights concern? No. There was an American international lawyer who said, yes, the survival of the whale is a human rights matter. It's a matter of my right to take photographs of the whale and other people's rights to eat the whale, right? Now, something gets missing there. What's missing is the whale, right? That there is a respect and duties owed to nature. So I think we've got to get away from this mindset that, oh, there is some special part of ethics like called trustworthiness or human rights. And that is the magic bullet for dealing with AI. I think AI is pervasive, therefore the whole of morality applies to it.
So let's take 2 more questions. I have a number here. We can't take all of them. One is, why has there been any lack in intellectual preparedness to COVID, as you mentioned? And it was a pandemic was expected sooner or later. Is there a need for an AI-driven alarm clock?
Yes, I think there is. I think, look, there was 2 things. I think it was widely known that a pandemic of this sort was on the cards. And I think it's just part of human inertia that action wasn't taken because it's very difficult to get humans to incur costs for something that isn't right now an imminent threat. So I think I've got nothing to contribute to that except just noticing that aspect of human nature. As for why, if I focus the question more narrowly on why we didn't have our ethical categories in place, what I would say, especially to young people listening to this, is on issues like human rights, we are still at a very rudimentary stage of understanding their nature, right? And people who are serious and honest in this area know that. and especially things like socioeconomic rights, the right to health, there isn't the centuries-long tradition of thinking about those rights. So it's very naive to think that we've already solved what the nature of those rights is and how they relate to common goods. So I think it's just a wake-up call for us to see, don't assume that because there is something called human rights law that it's in perfectly good order and we can mobilize it in addressing things like COVID. Understand that human rights law itself is man-made and therefore deeply fallible, and a lot of it is just very new.
I think this is a nice segue to the last question that we have here. Do you think the application of AI in various fields may also impact our view towards human rights? To what extent might new rights arise or increase in importance, such as a right to information?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely true. I think the more pervasive AI becomes, the greater the likelihood that we have to start rethinking what rights we have. Now, some of it might be that we have to adopt a more expansive understanding of existing rights. So we might have to say, for example, in a world where AI is taking lots of decisions, then what exactly the right to fair trial consists in has to be expanded in ways that we didn't have to expand before because we didn't have, for example, robots making decisions. So we have to start talking about the right to a certain kind of explanation, for example, or it could be the case that we have to start thinking about the right to a human decision. Now, not across the board, but we didn't have to think about that before because there was no real option for having a non-human decision. But now we might have to say, look, sometimes what matters to us really is just getting the correct outcome. If in cancer diagnosis, I want whatever will deliver the correct diagnosis. I don't care if it's a machine or if it's a human. But in something like sentencing someone to imprisonment, we also think what matters is not just, do I get a fair sentence, but who's sentencing me? And there's a qualitative difference if I'm being sentenced by a machine as opposed to being sentenced by a fellow citizen. So for sure, I think it will force us to rethink whether we have to expand or change existing rights and add new rights. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We are almost out of time. I wanted to take a final moment to let you all know about our upcoming events. In August and September, we are taking a short summer break with our speaker series. But in autumn, we have some very exciting events planned for you. Our Responsible AI Forum, a short tea rife, will take place at the Holiday Inn Munich Center from December 6th to December 8th. This three-day event will bring together members of industry, civil society, government, and academia to discuss the most relevant and pressing issues related to the responsible use of AI through shared stories, cutting-edge research, and practical applications. Please check our website and get your tickets soon. But we also have two very interesting speakers in October and November in line. On 28th of October, we have Shannon Weller from the University of Edinburgh with us. And on November 11th, Mark Findlay from Singapore Management University. Last but not least, I wanted to remind you that the best way to stay up to date with our news and events is to visit our website, subscribe to our newsletter, and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. So I would like to thank once again John Tasioulas for his fabulous lecture, for accepting our invitation, and all of you for joining us and contributing to the discussion with your questions, commands, and remarks. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the great questions.